But as the organizer of the panel, I would like to just start to give you a sense of why we are having this panel. Then I let Dr. Pelley take over from there. Could you, so the title of our roundtable is 50 Years Later, Reflections on the Meanings of 1975 through scholarly trends on the two Vietnams. So we're looking back to the time when Vietnam was still divided, right? So there were two Vietnams, the North Vietnam and the South Vietnam. And for a long time, we didn't really understand, many things in both North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and the scholarly trends in the last 2 decades or so, especially since the last 2 decades, help us a lot to understand what was going on in North Vietnam during the war, what was going on in South Vietnam during the war, and help us to see 1975, 50 years ago, like the anniversary, the event. We can now see 1975 maybe in a new light. Please get the slide. So the chair and moderator of this panel, like this roundtable, like I said, is Dr. Patricia Pelley, and I will turn over to her in a minute. She's a professor of history here at Texas Tech University. And then George Veith, who's an independent scholar of Vietnamese history, especially South Vietnam, Republic of Vietnam. And then Professor Hoang is a professor at Pepperdine University. And then Dr. Trinh, who is an independent scholar of Vietnamese and Vietnamese American literature. And finally, I'm a political science professor at the University of Oregon. Next, please. So the meanings of 1975 remain to be contested in the U.S., in Vietnam, among the diaspora, in the scholarship, and in the popular media as well. So the meanings remain very much deeply, hotly contested. It can be seen as a victory, a triumph, but then there are questions about what kind of history, what was won, how was it won, was it worth it, was the victory worth it, given the cost, what was achieved, reunification, independence, freedom, happiness. So that's kind of like questions raised about that particular meaning. The second meaning that 1975 brings to us is many consider it as a tragedy for South Vietnam. But then there are questions about that too. What was lost? Did South Vietnamese actually lose their country? And how and who were responsible for that loss? What lessons from that loss? And many people also said, who liberated who? Like the North liberated the South, or Southern people actually liberated Northerners. And finally, did war actually end in 1975? Did Vietnam really have peace after the war? And we know that Vietnam did not, right? So the war ended. One war ended in 1975, but then there was another war, right, between Vietnam and Cambodia, and Vietnam and China, that took as long as a decade after that. And the Vietnamese continued to suffer for many more years. So, did 1975 matter at all? And in what way it mattered, right? Because if Vietnamese continued to suffer after the war, then how important is the event for history? Next, please. Oh, that's it for just the introduction to the roundtable. And now I let Dr. Pelley take over.
It's a pleasure to see all of you here this afternoon. I myself have not worked extensively on Vietnam War scholarship, so I'm grateful to hear all of your luminous comments on this topic. And in particular, I look forward to hearing the comments of our panelists today. So I think what we're planning to do is summary comments and consolidating comments. And then, from my perspective, the most important part is hearing your questions, hearing your comments. So I hope that we all have a vigorous discussion in the aftermath of the papers. Okay, so let me find where we are. Okay. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to turn the tables over to Veith.
Thank you very much. The theme of the panel is trying to look at scholarly trends, but there's a couple of points within that. So if you look at scholarly trends, you basically have to look at the war in several phases. There's the French Indochina War, the American War, and then the post-war. And then within those two areas, you've got studies that focus on North Vietnam, studies that focus on South Vietnam. So I just want to begin my remarks by commenting that as I work on my new book, which is a history of how the North Vietnamese won the war, I think that we can no longer look at the first Indochina War and the second Indochina War in isolation. What happened in the first Indochina War in terms of North Vietnam and their policies and how they saw the war and how they fought the war are very much used in the second Indochina War. And so scholars that try to differentiate the two, I think, are making a huge mistake. And I want to make that point as emphatically as I can, because you see logistics, you see battlefield tactics, you see how they build their networks in the South that start in the first Indochina War, which even actually predate that and predate that into the wars against Thailand and Cambodia in the 1800s. You see how the Vietnamese repurpose those same exact things for the American War. And particularly you see it in terms of logistics and how they fund the war in the South and building their networks, especially all the way deep down in the Mekong Delta. So that's my first point I want to make. The second point that I make about North Vietnam is that what we have is a growing but still incomplete body of literature, although people in this room are helping to and Dr. Wu also has helped overcome that, is we still have a very hard time seeing behind the old bamboo curtain how policy was made in North Vietnam, decisions that were made, particularly in terms of military strategy, although the communists have published a lot of that. So I think those doors are slowly opening, but we still have a great deal of work to do in terms of seeing how their decision making. And a lot of it has to do with not so much a lack of archives, but just a lack of American scholars who speak Vietnamese, which I'm not one of them, ability to take a look at the memoirs and their published materials to understand exactly what they were thinking. And it's spread across multiple volumes. And so you see, and you'll see in my book, the citations to a history of the General Staff, a history of the Resistance Wars, the Cosman Chronicles, which is a primary source, General Staff Chronology, which I'm using heavily, and a whole host of memoirs to sort of piece together their decision-making over time. So then turning to South Vietnam, you basically have two periods of time. You have the First Republic and the Second Republic. And I would suggest that we need to study the Second Republic much more, because the First Republic, in my personal opinion, has been done to death. You see, what is there, 8 biographies of Diem, and there's nothing on Tuong. I was the first sort of book on Tuong in the Second Republic in Drawing Swords, and there's still a lot of ground to cover in terms of Tuong and his policies. Unfortunately, Archives 2, and Cody can certainly disagree with me on this, doesn't have a great deal of material on what Tuong was thinking. You see sort of his hand notes and on documents and stuff. But my Ph.D. dissertation was on democracy studies, and this is an area that I think deserves a great deal more study, and that how the South Vietnamese people, the political parties, and other people saw democracy. What does democracy mean in a Vietnamese context? Not in the American context, not in the British, not in the French, but what does it mean to be a country at war trying to build democracy? And that to me is just an absolutely fascinating question and really goes to the heart of how South Vietnam was trying to do two things at the same time: build the nation and fight the war, all right? And those two things are often almost diametrically opposed and always tugging at each other. Because obviously the communists used the open society of the democratic society as much to its advantage as it possibly could. So you see this constant tug of war between trying to have an open society, trying to have a democracy, and yet not give the communists sort of an open door into undermining them. So, and then lastly, we have the post-war studies, which we just touched on in the last panel, and I was having a conversation with somebody outside about, looking at sort of like post-war resistance in the South, which there was some, it wasn't very effective, but there was some, and efforts to sort of, you had this society that had spent the last 20 years undergoing various attempts at building capitalism, at building democracy, at creating what you called a sort of a mercantile society from the bottom up, not from the top down. And suddenly you're trying to change all that by trying to impose this command economy and this highly structured, disciplined party apparatus on top of it. And how that failed and how that succeeded and how that went about is, to me, a fascinating subject that I personally have not delved too deeply into, but I think would be a great area of study for future scholars. So I'll just summarize very quickly. I don't think we can look, I actually believe we cannot look at the first Indochina War and the second Indochina War in isolation anymore in terms of communists. That there's been a great deal of effort looking at the First Republic, but not enough on the Second Republic. We need to take more look at economic building, democracy building, and then post-war trying to look at how the communists tried to impose themselves on a democratic society. Thank you very much.
I think I will need my slideshow. All right. Okay, so thank you, Jay, for setting the tone. Indeed, I have two portions in my hopefully 10 minutes. I'm right here. Okay, so for the first half, I will talk a little bit more about the historiography that Jay has nicely begun, and then I will focus on Catholicism, right, specifically in South Vietnam. To simplify things a bit, right, the topic of politics and society in South Vietnam came out of the broader historiography about the RVN, the Republic of Vietnam, and I think we can divide it up into two periods, right? Basically from 1999, just to pick a convenient number, all the way back to the 1960s, right? When we see mostly American historiography, right, focusing on American involvement and the society and politics of South Vietnam became kind of like a byproduct, right, of American involvement, right? And so I just, put up a few representative works, one published, written by two former urban generals, the South Vietnamese Society, and I think it was published in 1976. And I think it took what I call the Rudyard Kipling perspective. Some of you know, right, that famous poem of Kipling, East is East and West is West, and the twins shall never meet. Okay, now the poem is more complicated than that, but I'll just begin there, right? That is kind of like their thesis, that Vietnamese and Americans couldn't understand each other. So, it was messy, it was bad, right? Nonetheless, though, I think being South Vietnamese themselves, they were more sympathetic, obviously, right, to the situation in the South Vietnamese society and politics, okay? More aggressive against the RVN, would be an example, Gabriel Coco, right, his probably best known work, Anatomy of a War, right, in which, the Vietnamese were pretty passive dependent on American workers. So in a sense, it continues this wartime historiography, right, about depicting the RVN, right, to be utterly dependent on American provisions and such, right? And then, right, the Vietnam television history. I mean, I remember watching it, and noting, first of all, society comes very little in it, and oftentimes, right, you would see prostitutes, bar girls, right, and rather than victims of war, right, and then like soldiers, searching for changes from dead body of the people from the Tet Offensive and so on. So extremely negative, I would say. Okay, now, good thing is that it has begun to change in the last quarter century, which is, I think, a very nice development. I mean, I just had 3 representative works here, including one, by our own Veith here. And this one, right, begins with people like Ed Miller, who has a foot in American foreign relationships, right, and but also looking into Vietnamese archives, and so okay, unlike Jay, I have to say I think there should still be more work on Zim, but that's okay. That's okay. I completely understand what you were saying about right. There has been so much, and so indeed, Jay's work, right, is among the first at least monographs, right, specifically deal with the Second Republic, right? I mean, and there have been more other works. I mean, I just didn't want to crowd the slides, with so many. I mean, I think I saw Heather Stir somewhere down here, and Dr. Stir has published a book about Saigon in the 1970s. Another work is Olga Tron, right? She published a book about education in North and South Vietnam. It is actually a truly comparative work, and I know that there are many scholars, Simon Toner in England published a terrific, piece of work about Thieu and the economic situation. Sean Fear also in England, is hopefully his monograph will come out before too long about it. So we are in a good place, in regard to that, right? Now, one more slide about this one, and that is I would call that there is a kind of like a 2.5 way, less on high politics, even though one can never leave high politics when one, look into the RVN. But there is more of a focus on society here, and I think virtually everybody on this panel has contributed to one of these 2 volumes, that Trinh and Tuong and Tuan, have edited in the last couple of years. But I do want to give a special place to Veith Marshall, about her recent monograph, right? It's actually a finished short one. You can even read it in one sitting. But I think it is very foundational, and I think, it sort of hopefully set the tone, right, for further research regarding civil society. Okay, so very speedy, very quick. Okay, so now I'm going to turn into one aspect of that civil society, right, the Catholic Church and the Catholics in the RVN. I do have a few things to talk about North Vietnam, but I think for the sake of time, I'll leave it maybe for the Q&A. So let me, focus more on this one. And so, I would say the starting point is, once again, Charles Keith, right, at Michigan State University has published a terrific book, the best, sort of like a standard era, so to speak, if you want to study Catholicism in Vietnam now. And it is upright to the 1950s, okay? And so I would say, I think, based, on the basis of Keith's book, we should look into, how the Catholics in the Republic of Vietnam took a momentum of, this post-colonial moment, and sort of like they took it and they ran with it. And so we saw an era of expansion. Okay, yes, most historiography about Catholics have been focused on the migration from north to south, right? And which is good, but like most studies tend to stop there. And I think that if we look deeper into this topic, right, we would see, a flourishing of organizations everywhere, right, from like, teenagers or preteens even, to senior citizens, within the church. There was this flourishing of organizations, belonging, modern organizations that we can trace back to the 1930s, And so, and so, and I sort of like for fun, I just threw in a small photo on the other side, right? And that is actually, believe it or not, North Carolina in just a few years ago, a couple of years ago, right? And it's amazing for me to begin to make a connection, right, between what is going on in the diaspora today and what, took place in the 1930s, the 1940s in Vietnam, but especially, and I want to emphasize that, especially the 1960s and the 1970s, right? Because that was when civil society for the Catholics were really, really flourishing. And then, by the well, first of all, the Vatican established the National Vietnamese Church in 1960, okay? And so, the Vietnamese were no longer a missionary territory. They became a national church. And, that was just affirming something that has already happened up to that point. Yeah. And so, from that point on, right, the bishops, like 95% of them were Vietnamese. Priests, maybe a little less because there was still a lot of missionary priests in South Vietnam, but the number, was rising. In fact, if I may just throw in, some counterfactual. I mean, I noticed that in this conference there have been quite a, many questions and theses about counterfactuals. My counterfactual is this: if there was not the fall of Saigon, I think that today the Republic of Vietnam, if it still existed, would have been sending Catholic missionaries to Africa, to South America, to the U.S. That is my thesis, okay? Because I think looking at this, this momentum, right, we see not just a growth, but I would even say a flourishing of seminarians, of priests, nuns, and then, overall Catholic education, in schooling, right? There was, already there was at least one Catholic university in Saigon in the 1970s, right? And, I would presume that there would be more coming in precisely because of that. But obviously that, did not happen because of 1975. Okay, and then a couple more slides here. Another thing that I think is underrated is music, church music. And it began already in 1945, okay? That was when a lot of seminarians, mostly in Hanoi, were writing, famous hymns like, Hang Lam, a classic, right? That even today, Catholics still sing on Christmas Day. And the Republic of Vietnam saw, right, this flourishing of hymnal music, many of which are still sung to this day. I did notice, I'll talk more about that, but essentially I would say that, this is a very underrated aspect about, about society, right? Because it is, we often focus on writers, and rightly so, but we also need to think about, not just popular music, a panel yesterday was discussing, but even like church music, and even, I don't know enough about Protestants and Buddhists, but I would suspect that, there was some development on that respect as well. And then there was Vatican II, okay, and hey, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll finish with this slide, okay, so 30 seconds. Just an example of, of this momentum, right? So this is a brand new parish in Saigon, created in 1968, right? And I love, you look at the photos, right? You can see lay involvement heavily, right? Sure, they often put a priest or sometimes a nun, on front of a photo, right? Because after all, they were the spiritual leaders and so on, right? But you can see, right, like a flourishing of an organization I was talking about. Up there, right, Eucharistic Youth, up there. Down here, I think it's like a Young Women Association. I'm not sure which one, but you can tell that they belong to one because of the uniforms that they are wearing. And then, and then on the other side, right, you see girls receiving First Communion, and then procession and burials. Okay, so just a quick illustration of what was going on at the time. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'll address one of the scholarly trends that Jay helpfully outlined by looking at the legal and educational policies that were enacted in North Vietnam and how they carry over to the post-war period. So it's widely known that after 1975, the communist government launched a sweeping campaign to confiscate and destroy cultural materials from South Vietnam. branded them as decadent and reactionary. And these efforts carry over well into the 1980s. Youth brigades were sent into private homes. They seized books, publications, and all types of media and burned them publicly. The communist government didn't stop there. They arrested South Vietnam's most celebrated artists, writers, and thinkers, and imprisoned them indefinitely in re-education camps. So the picture you see here, in this picture you see a youth-led parade in front of the Notre Dame Cathedral, with participants carrying banners denouncing reactionary South Vietnamese culture and promoting socialist values. So what exactly explains this communist hostility towards South Vietnamese culture? So to partly answer that question, I'll discuss two key concepts that the communist government mobilized to call for the erasure of South Vietnamese cultural life. The first, socialist economic crime, refers to economic crimes or offenses committed against the socialist state. It was especially common in the Soviet Union, in China, and in other centrally planned economies. In Vietnam, the concept came into use after the war, when the Socialist Republic of Vietnam created a temporary criminal code to secure property for the state. And over time, the idea of economic crime blended with a second concept, romantic anti-capitalism, a belief that the arts could redeem this corrupt world of capitalism. So these two discourses merge and fuel such a distaste for cultural purity that by 1978, simply possessing South Vietnamese cultural artifacts was treated as an economic offense comparable to treason. So to clarify this connection between socialist economic crime, romantic anti-capitalism, and the suppression of South Vietnamese culture, I'll do two things. First, I'll provide just some historical context to explain how socialist economic crime and romantic anti-capitalism was developed in North Vietnam. And then in the second half, I'll analyze a key scene from Tạo Ninh Sasor of War, in which a soldier loots Tân Sơn Nhất International Airport to examine how Vietnamese fiction portrays the destruction of South Vietnamese culture. So socialist economic crime first appeared in North Vietnam in the 1960s when the government tried to take full control of the economy. The North Vietnamese Communist government issued a series of decrees throughout the 1960s and 70s, targeting speculation, hoarding, and any trade that was outside of the planned economy. Right after April 1975, these principles were applied to the whole country. The Communist government issued a decree defining economic crime as any action that caused financial loss to the state. So punishments were severe. It included imprisonment and execution for activities like hoarding and unlicensed trade. At about the same time, the government launched a large campaign to wipe out South Vietnamese culture. It issued a circular dividing South Vietnamese cultural artifacts into two categories. The first is reactionary media that promoted imperialist ideas. The second is literature promoting fantasy and licentiousness. Both types were banned and confiscated. So why was getting rid of Republican-era books just as important as securing property for the socialist state? So to answer this question, we need to look at how North Vietnam defined socialist morality before 1975. North Vietnam's legal and cultural policies were heavily shaped by Soviet-style communist morality. In the 1960s, North Vietnamese intellectuals praised the Soviet Union's moral code of the builders of communism as the highest and most just form of morality. And one influential theorist was Đào Tuong, the author of Youth and Communist Morality. He believed that by teaching communist morality, every Vietnamese citizen would be transformed to love work and country and to sacrifice himself for the collective. And for this theorist, communist morality meant, above all, a commitment to world revolution. He argued that a true Vietnamese revolutionary must combine nationalism with proletarian internationalism, fighting for Vietnam's liberation just as fiercely as for the freedom of other colonized nations. And Dao Tung saw the destruction of Western culture as essential to saving the Vietnamese character and soul. This idea of purifying national identity by rejecting capitalist influences became known as romantic anti-capitalism. It was an effort to redeem the Vietnamese spirit and enrich the revolutionary culture by eliminating bourgeois values. So romantic anti-capitalist sentiment didn't fade after the war. In fact, it intensified. Soon after 1975, the Ministry of Culture and Information teamed up with the police to crack down on smugglers carrying goods, this time including printed works. As part of the campaign to fight capitalist and illegal trade, teams of economic inspectors worked with the police to catch offenders. On February 20th, 1978, for instance, 5 people were arrested and charged with not just orchestrating plans to destroy the economy, but also with circulating depraved and reactionary music. By the late 1970s, economic and cultural offenses had become indistinguishable. To combat economic crimes, which now included the trade in Republican cultural artifacts, the government issued a circular in 1981, declaring that the struggle against reactionary and depraved culture is at heart a fierce class struggle. So party officials believe that neo-colonial culture was the root cause of economic crimes. To them, theft of state property was the fault of petty shopkeepers who were seen as spreading corrupt cultural tastes. And as seen in Soviet Russia, the figure of the prostitute became a symbol of South Vietnamese culture. While government documents portray socialist economic crime as a problem rooted in the South, the Star of War suggests that North Vietnamese socialist law set the stage for the rise of economic criminals. The novel evokes this alternative history through 2 scenes of crime. The first, set in the 1960s, North Vietnam is about bicycle theft. This was a common crime viewed as a threat to socialist property regime. The second scene shows how North Vietnamese soldiers looted a Saigon International Airport as the war comes to an end. So for this presentation, I'll quickly go through the second scene. Part of the Star of War describes North Vietnamese soldiers looting Tanzania International right after taking it over. The novel presents 1975 as the moment when North Vietnamese soldiers confront Saigon through the figure of a dead prostitute, as capitalism brought to an end. So the soldiers search the airport for items to loot. One man stumbles over her naked body. He drags the corpse down a flight of stairs, lifts her, and swings her out onto the pavement. Meanwhile, other soldiers keep looting as if on a shopping spree. Officers and soldiers run back and forth, grabbing whatever they can find. No sooner is the very symbol of capitalism tossed out than a new market takes shape. This, I believe, is the irony that the novel works towards, where revolutionaries represent to North Vietnamese philosophers the ultimate repudiation of capitalism. They appear in this scene all too eager to abandon communist ethics, ignoring the communist government's prohibition on looting. At one point, the soldiers stop looting to clean and dress the girl at Tanzania. But the scene takes a different turn when the soldiers finally drink themselves into a stupor. The girl appears before Tuan as a ghost. She has shed the clothes, her hair is undone. By having the Tanzanian girl reappear as a ghost, the novel foreshadows, on the one hand, the failure of communist moral reform, and on the other, the return of capitalism under a different guise. So to conclude, in North Vietnam, the primary function of law was to establish socialist moral values. Economic crime legislation wasn't just about protecting socialist property, but it's also about rooting out moral corruption. After 1975, these laws were enforced on a much larger scale and used to enforce ideological purity. Socialist property, law, and morality were interlocked in this way. The government repeatedly tried to stop the trade in Republican-era cultural artifacts, fearing that the bourgeois values could corrupt revolutionaries. So although the party state once pushed for total revolution, it eventually realized that market economics was its only way forward. So in this context, post-1975, is a story about the struggle of political men and women to get on top of their world and the economic forces that bested them. Thank you.
Trin's presentation brought back memory of me in middle school. Like one day, maybe 1979, 1980, I walked to the back of the office, school office, and there was no one there. But then there was a stack of books and piled up, and I was curious. I pulled out one, and it was Một ngày trong đời, Ivan Denisovich, Solzhenitsyn's book, you know, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It was a thin book, and I brought back to my desk and hid it under my desk. And then I was trying to read it during class, and then I was caught by the teacher, who saw me trying to do something suspicious. And then he walked down and then asked me, like, what you doing? What book are you reading? And I showed him the book and said, "You're not supposed to read this." And he took it away from me. I think I just, you know, I barely had time to really read anything. But that was just a memory I had of that time. But we have made a lot of progress in the study of North Vietnam, and these are the books that published in the early to mid 2000s. Dr. Pelley, one of the pioneering authors who studied North Vietnam and taught us a lot about, you know, the Cultural Revolution in North Vietnam, beginning in the late 1940s, and then how they tried to reinterpret national history. And then there was the author, Hoang, economic historian of Vietnam, who published, you know, very thick volumes on the history of Vietnamese economy. And then Veith is a political scientist who studied collectivization in North Vietnam and how it was a failure, but then the leaders, you know, keep trying, never wanted to give up. Then, you know, in the last decade or so, we've seen more books coming out, including my book. So we have looked at various process of how the North Vietnamese communist state was established, you know, in 1945, 1946. The book by David Marr. Pierre Asselin looks at the process in which they decided to launch the war in South Vietnam. My book looks at the entire history of the Vietnamese communist movement from the 1920s all the way to the 2010, showing their deep commitment to Marxism-Leninism in the form of Stalinism and Maoism. Olga draws, someone mentioned her book, compares South Vietnam and North Vietnam, and showing how North Vietnam was able to control the mindset of their youth, of its youth, turning them into fighters for the cause of the party, turning them into loyal fighters for the party. Dr. Hoang over there, he published a book on mass mobilization in the late 50s. Late 40s and mid 50s, showing how they were very effective in mobilizing manpower and rural resources, taxes, and so on, you know, to help them fight the war with the French. Christophe Gaucha's book set a new standard for the scholarship by looking at, you know, how war communism transformed the North Vietnamese communist state from a relatively ineffective state into a very effective state, and the key was Maoism, right? So they implemented a lot of communist tactics together with tactics of statecraft, and also relying on Chinese support to build a very effective state that helped them to win the war with the French. And Dr. Alex Tagore over there, his book, his manuscript, I hope to be published soon on the land reform and the communist use of violence during the land reform to establish their dominance in the countryside. So basically, I have 5 minutes left. The essential findings are 5. First, Vietnamese communist leaders were ambitious radicals. So that's what the American-centric scholars failed to understand. They're really ambitious radicals. They had radical visions, and they were ambitious. They were true believers in Marxism, Leninism, and they were also politically astute state builders, right? So they built a state that lasted a long time. And their regime state was built by effective mobilization of people and resources, and also by violence and extreme brutalities, if necessary. The communist state maintained systematic, institutionalized, which the political scientists call it totalitarian control over and manipulation of people. This is also very important. The fortunes of their revolution rose and fell with foreign support. So they were also dependent from external support, just like South Vietnam. But then it's a kind of different kind of relationship. It's not similar to South Vietnam. So the fortunes of their revolution were tied to the fortune of the global communist radical movement. And when it rose globally, it also rose in North Vietnam. When it fell globally, it also fell in North Vietnam. And so the support came not only in terms of physical support, resources, material resources, but also ideological support and other kind of support. And 1975 was the peak of the revolution, which fully revealed their ambitions to lead world revolution. So summary, a few questions that I'm just wrapping up here. So why did Hanoi win? So I mean, basically what I can summarize and kind of in a very simplistic way. Besides the mistakes by their rivals, it was a combination of ideology. By that I mean deep commitment to the Marxism, Leninism that made them that helped them to get support from the Soviet bloc and China for a long time. So combination of ideology, combination with organization that control the livelihood, like the cooperatives that control the livelihood of the people, the state-owned enterprises, and also control the mindset of their people, right? And then finally, violence is the third factor. The next questions: why did Vietnamese communists fail in their revolution? Like I said, that the fortunes of their revolution rose and fell with the global communist revolution. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, that's when the end. And then, but then they already failed before because of the radicalism of their ideas that were really utopian. It could not have been a success. It has never been succeeded anywhere. So that's kind of the problem with their revolution. But then why has the communist regime lasted for so long? The other scholars, not just Vietnamese scholars, but other scholars in comparative politics point out that the early violence that these communist regimes, from the Russian communists to the Chinese to the Cubans and so on, the early violence that they unleashed against their enemies against landlords, against other classes, the upper classes, was very important in destroying any potential base of social support for their rivals. Right? So by eliminating not just a few hundred opponents, but then thousands and thousands of landlords who were prominent people in the countryside, they actually, secure their control of the countryside for decades, right? So that's an argument that political scientists have made, and also the totalitarian system that they created that helped them control the economy and the mindset of the people. So what does 1975 mean in retrospect? And I believe that, at this point, based on scholarship, it means a short-term victory for global communism and radical movements, global radical movements, but a disaster for Vietnam and Indochina in the medium to long term. So that's why, after the war, Vietnamese continue to suffer. Right? It was a disaster. They actually suffer even more. So it was a disaster for Vietnam, and many millions of them had to flee, right? Had to get out of the country. But it was a victory for the global communist and global radical movements. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
So let me thank our four panelists for their extraordinary comments. Thank all of you very much. I'm going, as I try to gather my thoughts here, I think I'll begin with the paper by Professor Tuong. And in a way, it links to all the other papers as well. The question of violence repeatedly arises, right? And we speak particularly about the violence of the DRV, of northern Vietnamese political elites, the military, etc. And obviously that's an important, it's a crucial consideration, right? The violence of northern Vietnamese, and I'll use the word that Professor Tuong used, unleashed on other Vietnamese people. And that's a truth, that's a reality that no one can deny. I think all of us in this room are keenly aware of it. And I would never, ever dispute that. At the same time, I wonder how a revolutionary movement, an anti-colonial movement, I would start with that, an anti-colonial movement against a brutal French occupation. And so I wonder, how is it possible to overthrow a brutal regime and not, I guess this is the question, is it possible to overthrow a brutal regime, the French occupation authorities and regime, without, so this is my question, is it possible to do that without replicating some of the same kinds of violence, right? If we take, for example, the question of land reform, the Catholic Church, landlords and the Catholic Church suffered disproportionately from land reform. And one of the things that strikes me is that when you look at the documents of individual parishes, of individual dioceses and so forth, one of the things they always point out as a way of opposing the Communist Party is that they bought the land on which their church was built, right? Or the land on which the parish communities were established. And yet, the idea of buying the land and having title to the land is to my mind, sort of a misnomer, right? Because the French authorities confiscated property and then turned around and sold it. So yeah, there is a question of purchasing, right? Purchasing land, having legal, I'm going to put that in quotation marks, legal title, because it was produced by the French regime that was also responsible for the confiscation of land. And so it's right, it's normal, it's unavoidable to speak about the violence of the northern regime. But I would also like to contextualize it in the face of, what, 80 years of extreme violence on the part of France. So that's a question I would like to introduce to our discussion. Okay. Let's see, and I'll move backwards into Tuan's presentation. One of the things that I found so striking is that the proliferation of Catholic institutions that you described, all of those existed in the north as well. And for example, the Jeunesse Ouvrière, they were also active in the revolution. So I think one of the, and Tuan, I think, did a lot to clarify that. There isn't, as far as I can see, a clear rupture between Catholicism in the north and Catholicism in the south, even though, obviously, in the north, the party tried to, it succeeded in many cases, co-opting Catholics and Catholic communities. But also, in many cases, Catholics were already involved in the revolutionary movement. And I think that's an impression or a reality that I try to keep in mind in my own research. It's not that Catholics fled uniformly to the south, although obviously a majority of them did. What's also interesting to me is when we look at Kuxika, the great migration of principally northern Catholics to southern Vietnam, many of those communities reproduced themselves almost identically to what existed in the north. And to my surprise, let's see, maybe it was 2013 when I visited some of the southern parishes, recreations of northern parishes. All of them, the people there, the priests obviously, but even younger people, still spoke northern Vietnamese. So I think that's a striking reminder of the sort of corporate quality of these communities that fled, that left the north in 1954. What I would also like to emphasize is that I'm not sure the extent to which that was a domestic and sort of locally rooted movement, because so many international agencies and governments were involved, right? So to what extent would northern Catholics have left for the south without the very concerted, I'll use the word propaganda, of the United States, of Catholic organizations internationally, and so forth. Ching's paper, I think, is so important, right? Because in the discussion of wars, maybe there's a tendency, an unwarranted tendency, to speak almost exclusively of military and political conditions, military and political factors. And Ching's paper, I think, takes us well beyond that by looking specifically at the culture, right? At the culture of the southern Vietnamese regime, but also the culture that the DRV tried to impose on the south. And those images are brutal, right? Those are violent, brutal images that to a degree reflect events that had already occurred in northern Vietnam as well. The sort of violent repression of culture, of movements, of people who opposed the northern regime. And last, let me say a few words about Jay's paper. I think the question he poses is essential, right? What does democracy mean? When we speak about democracy, whose democracy is it, right? Whose people? If we go back to the Greek origins, right? Power of the So which people, right? Which people? Because it seems in all regimes, not only in revolutionary regimes, democracy seems particularly aimed and expressive of certain people and diminishes the involvement, the responsibility, the interests of other groups. So I look forward to hearing comments from all of you, questions for our brilliant panelists. Thank you very much. Yes, I guess what we've been doing in previous panels is inviting people to come. Okay, there it is. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question for Dr. Liu. I'm a novelist and I'm writing a book that actually focuses entirely on what you presented. And so I'm curious to know what do you think about the Pelley and the books that came out during that time, like Tuong's Paradise of the Blind and so many other books that later became banned, and how, what did North Vietnam think, or what did the policies of cultural erasure think when the products produced were then communists or northerners saying things essentially that they didn't like?
Thank you, Zora, for a brilliant question. I'm of two minds about renovation literature. On the one hand, I think it's commendable that North Vietnamese, those who lived through the war, experienced it firsthand, was able to write so touchingly about their experiences, what happened in North Vietnam, in Paradise of the Blind, for instance, what happened to North Vietnamese soldiers in Vietnamese War, and in other cases. On the other hand, there is still a tendency that we see in much of those works, a dismissal of the South Vietnamese government. Not only of its government, but its people. There are portrayals of South Vietnam in those texts that resonate more or less with the way the Communist Party presented South Vietnam. So for instance, the image of the prostitute in the Sort of War is more or less the way North Vietnam discussed South Vietnam throughout the war and much of it after, and much after. So I think it's a rich body of literature that should be read just to better understand how the Vietnamese, especially North Vietnamese, experienced the war. But it should be complemented with works that are written by those who lived through the war in the South, in the South.
Yes, please.
My thanks to Mr. Cow. Just sort of first a comment and then a question to the panel. My comment is that I think this conversation here is now taking place in Hanoi at a very high level, and it's very important, given the fact that about 4 months ago, the new Secretary General To Lam made a cryptic reference to Vietnam entering a new era. Kinh nguyện mới. So this is brought forth, and I'm not sure that the public is aware of this, but for the last several months, there has been an effusion of sort of samizdat programs, comments, what the future of Vietnam might be. And my sense is that this has involved intellectuals inside the party, outside the party, most of them writing under pen names. Civil society is involved, other people are involved, people overseas, and no one has been brought before the police. There's been no statement from the party or the government that this intellectual movement must stop. And I would like to bring everybody's attention to, particularly this group, I don't know what you would call it in English, a statement, an essay by To Lam of last week on April 4, which is entitled Entering the Global System. And in there are two things I would like to suggest to the group, the scholars, which are worth noticing. One, in 4,000 words, there is no mention of Marxist-Leninism. And there is no mention of socialism, xã hội chủ nghĩa. Secondly, there seems to be what has to be an intentional effort to create a new discourse. So for example, if expressions like Vuong Minh, enlightenment, the larger scheme of things for a new Vietnam is Hội nhập, entering into a global system. So it may be that the topic of this panel and the work of all of you has great importance for Vietnam today. My question to the group, before Patricia, maybe I could say where my question comes from. It's my feeling that Marxist-Leninism from the beginning is completely inconsistent with Vietnamese values and Vietnamese cultures, which gave the Communist Party a certain problem, right? The particular thing that brought it to mind was your focus on property. Because as my understanding is, the property that we have is a heavenly gift. It comes to us as phúc đức. If we have a lot of phúc đức, we get wealth. If we have poor phúc đức, bad things happen. And then I think we should remember that the line from Nguyen Trai's instruction book for women, Sa Ung Ka, that phúc đức tai mão, your phúc đức comes from your mother. So my question to the panel is, should we have a conceptual framework of the Vietnamization of Marxist-Leninism? Thank you.
Okay, I'll start quickly. Focusing on the conflicts. Okay, but I'll pass the mic on. Let me begin by tying, Dr. Young's comments and question to what, our commentator said earlier about the Catholics. Okay, first of all, I was focusing on the divided period. So this is kind of like responding to Patricia's comment earlier. Yes, it's true that actually before 1954, Northern Vietnam actually was flourishing, even more in terms of church ecclesial expansion and so on. Yeah, in fact, most of the biggest organizations actually were in Hanoi, Wuju, and other, right? But obviously that drastically changed, right, with the migration to the south. Most dioceses in the north lost at least a third, but usually half of the lay population, and even more percentage-wise, even more priests left from the south. So that's really definitely that I think explains partially for why, right? In the RVN there was such a flourishing in a way that we didn't see before 1954. Okay, now on the land reform, actually, I'm co-editing a book about the history of Vietnamese Christianity for Brill. It has been accepted, and actually one of the chapters is focusing on Catholics Catholics and Protestants in North Vietnam during the war, and land reform is Dr. Young commented upon earlier was massive. I would even say that it's even worse than what we thought, because this historian in Hanoi, he was able to he had access to the archives in a way that many Western-based, scholars don't, and he was able to locate, a lot of reports, and it showed not just like all kinds of tension and pressure from the part of the government on, the Catholic Church, which was already drastically diminished because of the number, but also no seminarians were allowed to be ordained priests. So, so the number of priests were pretty static, right? And then educational programs, right? Schools were closed, Catholic schools were closed or converted into governmental property, and so on. So, in a sense, that already alluded, I think, to some of the problems, right? That Dr. Young mentioned earlier, right? About property and who's right, And then I think that issue magnified even more when it comes to land, actual land, some of which belong, right, to the church, farmland I'm talking about. Yes, I agree that I think even though land reform, right, has been studied a lot, but I think there should be, I think, more focus on, right, in this case, church properties, because I think it has long-standing consequences, right, even into the 2010s, right, in which we saw land dispute among some Catholic villages
anyways, let me address Dr. Young's points as quickly as possible. So I've met Tolam twice, and I hear what you're saying, Steve. I don't buy it, and I hope you're right. And I'll say this, and I'll give you the reason why, and you can tell me if you think wrong. But I met Tolam twice. He grew up in public security ranks. His father was a public security official during the war down in Taining province. Another whole story. I would be far more willing to accept what you just said if A, he didn't arrest Huiduck, if they did crack down on any Facebook posting, and if there wasn't other crackdowns on public expressions. The second point is that the comment, and I spent a lot, another point is, I spent a lot of time the last month and a half with Ambassador Zilton, the SRV ambassador in the United States, who's a great guy, by the way. But he has emphasized to me on more than one occasion, the Vietnamese party, right now, their number one goal is tech transfer from the U.S. to Vietnam, along with a bunch of other stuff. And the Communist Party has a long and very good history of masquerading the hand of the party in doing things. So I can easily see them withdrawing the whole part of the party to make the Americans more comfortable about tech transfer and education opportunities like that. So I'm not trying to be overly cynical, but I'm overly cynical, all right? And I think with good reason, all right? Very quickly, I'd like to address Dr. Pelley's points about political violence. So the main differentiator between a communist system and a democratic system is the use of violence to achieve a political end. The communists believe that political violence is necessary to overthrow the old regime, whereas a democratic side is looking at convincing him through rhetoric and stuff like that. And so Mao is a guy who said a revolution is not a dinner party. So they then justify the use of political violence because they would say the capitalist class are using violence to oppress us, right? So that was their justification for it. But there's a differentiation between fighting the French and using violence in a military setting to fight against an oppressor, right? Versus using violence in a class and struggle against your own people. When you institute a wave of terrorism against your own people, when you're trying to actually adjust the consciousness of people, and you use that by saying it, you're going to do it this way, and if you don't do it this way, we're going to put a gun to the back of your head, and you'll do it that way, and if you still don't do it, we're going to kill you. That is a very different use of violence. That is a use of political violence against your own people to achieve a different vision of reality, versus the French are oppressing us, we're going to liberate our country. That's a different kind of violence. So I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Very well said. There's a term for it, like among scholars who study genocide, and the term is politicide, meaning killing your political enemies. And it's kind of the nature of the violence, the techniques of violence, the targets of the violence is very different from the kind of violence that the French unleashed against the Vietnamese. But let's.
If I could just pick up one or two points that Jay has mentioned. One of the hallmarks of renovation is the rapid buildup of a complex legal system to anticipate the influx of global investments in Vietnam. So at that point in the mid-1980s, international observers also thought that Vietnam was making a different turn, that it was going to be an abandonment of the more hardline socialist values. But it turns out, as it was the case in China, it was more so because in the post-war period, the language of law became the dominant language to structure national and international politics. It was not so much about the abandonment of socialist Marxist values.
Please.
May I? Yes.
Yes,
So
please.
my question actually was conceived before you said what you just said, Jay, but following on that, and really for Bill and for Glenn. So all the talk about violence and the accompanying effects of that, how do you interpret what happened just 5 years ago when several battalions, or at least several companies, maybe a battalion of mixed political military forces were sent to a Catholic village near Hanoi to assassinate an 84-year-old former government official who was the leader of the village and perceived by the government as kind of the brain behind that village's claim for just compensation to some land. That's not land being taken over by a military airport. This is not the war. This is not consolidating authority in the 70s. This is 2020. So how do we see that now?
I better defer this to I think, because this is more contemporary. Yeah.
Well, you may say that it's a capitalist violence. It's yeah. I mean, it's the violence used to seize the land, right, from the farmers of that village. So there was a land dispute between the farmers, and then the state-owned enterprise owned by the Ministry of Defense, right, who also claimed that land and wanted to sell it or to build to develop it into a technological park or something. And so the peasants were fighting back, and they decided to do that. And Tolam actually, that happened in the Tolam, right? So yeah, so many of my colleagues who study Vietnam were surprised, were shocked when that happened. But I grew up in the South, in Saigon. After '75, I've seen Nhà thờ Vincent, Vincent Church, and many other cases which were attacked in the same way. And there was another Catholic, Dòng Tên, right? Tuong Dòng Tên. So I've seen that happen, and they just kind of, claim that the farmers or the church were harboring weapons and trying to overthrow the regime and so on, to crack down on that. But that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Please, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning. My name is Hoang. I'm an American politician in Atlanta, Georgia. And I would like to have comments about the conclusion in the summary of Dr. Tuong. Why did the communists win? Well, with all due respect, sir, they did not win. So that's very important for us, the people from the South, and for us, the Generation 1X. They did not win. The U.S. gave it to them. It's so many evidence that I studied since 1975. The Paris Accord, that's one evidence. The blockade of Haiphong port, and to the point that the communist Vietnam leader at the time were about to surrender. Jagan can attest to that. So they did not win. So item number 2 that I want to make a contribution is land reform. And you get talking, Dr. Pelley, about the French and how good the communists. President Diem, during his first year, he started with, what they call cải cách tiền địa. His program, he bought all of the land, he limited all of the owner to 100 acres. That's it. And he bought the land and he redistributed it to the people who work on the rice farm. And that continued on under President Hill, còn người cày có ruộng. So yes, the South focus on that to have improve the economy. Plus, the hamlet under the President Diem were tremendous successful. And one thing I want to say, just really quick, is that we need to kind of like send a message to the young people in Vietnam that it's time to rise up to help the Vietnam against Chinese. Chinese communists, they're about to die economically. So this is the most important thing for the young people to rise up. Just remember, the Pope tell the Polish, don't be afraid, stand up. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
I'm
I'll
sorry, I want to make a comment in connection with Veith. I'll just say.
Please
from
be
the
quick,
perspective-
please
yeah,
be
just
quick.
briefly, just a few seconds.
Yeah.
Whether who won, whatnot, look at the trend of the people, where they going. Are they moving north? Are they moving south? Are they moving back to the country to live? Are they moving overseas?
Thank you.
You got your answer.
we're running out of time. Let's go ahead and I'll answer him personally. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for a great presentation. My name is Ji-Hu Lee, and I was born after the fall of Saigon. However, my family is involved in the military of the South Vietnam. My question is, based on the conclusion of Dr. Hu, the communist is your short-term gain, right? But long-term is a disaster. My question is, growing up over here, overseas, I've actually did a lot of homework myself from my family, from my fellow friends and colleagues to learn about the facts about Vietnam Wars. And sadly enough, there are a lot of films, literature works that really distorted the historical fact about the Vietnam War. For example, the Vietnam War by Ken Burns. And yesterday, Heaven and Earth in the banquet, the book. So my question for you, scholar community, okay, what are the course of actions of other scholars who could some sort of rectify all the facts that are being distorted by media outlet, by individual? Because so far, based on my observation and from my community, the Vietnamese diaspora, we really observe all the work has been done is individual, books by scholars, but none has been really taken, action. And this create a lot of, anger, anxiety in the community. So my question for you today is that what are the course of action by the scholar community in order to rectify those distorted historical facts? Thank you. I hope I could get some insight.
Well, I can quickly respond to that. University of Oregon, we have the U.S. Vietnam Research Center, and we've been publishing like 5 books in the last 5 years on the new research on the Republic of Vietnam. And also we gave talk around the country: Boston, Houston, Dallas, Oklahoma City, Virginia, San Jose, Nam California, on our books and on the topics, like a year or two ago. And so we've done a lot trying to engage the community, bring the books into the U.S. libraries, and so we've done a lot, but certainly a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah, and to add to that, I don't want to stray too far so that Jay has a chance to respond to the other question. But I think that actually there has been a lot of collaboration between academics and the community. To give one example, right, in Orange County where I live, there is a museum, a Vietnamese heritage museum, and it began with a boat-person refugee, an engineer, a former engineer, right? He had nothing to do with academia, but he has involved a number of academics, myself included. I'm on the board, along with many other local academics and so on, and and that is actually a very fruitful way, right? Because after all, the initiative needs to come from the community, right? But then I think that a lot of academics are very readily, willing to cooperate. But just we have our own stuff to deal with, obviously. And so sometimes we are able to help with the initiative, but oftentimes, right, we have to wait. And but I just want to mention that because that is just one example that is pretty terrific. The museum, right, which is a one-person initiative, and now it has involved so many people, academics and non-academics alike. So
Yes, thank you, and I hope there's some sort of initiative.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for larger scale. Thanks a lot.
May I just add? Thank you for your question. May I just add to a degree, maybe to a great extent, I think that the dissonance that you described, the sort of differences in interpretation, the differences in evidence that one adduces, I think that's unavoidable. I can't think of any sort of global, any sort of monumental event or monumental process that doesn't invite the same sort of dissonance, the same sort of dissonance, the disagreement. I think it's even a necessary part of our discussion. Thank you. Yes, please, sir.
Yes, I wish to have a follow-up question to Professor Young and to the panelists regarding Marxist-Leninist communism. From what I can see and my understanding, yes, the Vietnamese communist is based on the foundation of Marxism and Leninist to start up the Socialist Democratic of Vietnam back to 1945 when Chairman Ho Chi Minh declared independence to the North. And they maintained that foundation after 75, tried to transform the South Vietnam into the whole country under communism. However, lately, the way I can see is the goal of the Communist Party is now more benefit-oriented, and they try to preserve the existence of the authoritarian Communist Party. And I don't see much of the Marxism and Leninist. It's just like a ghost under the way they actually govern the country. It is just a theory. So my question here is, given that Tolam, as Professor Young mentioned, did not mention about Marxism or Lenin theory, what if they declare that they will not use Marxism-Leninism, but what make different to the country if they still maintain the totalitarian communist? The same way, and particularly recently, Tolam is expand the police system, making it a police state. So how can we see the vision of the independence, freedom, and happiness? Those are the three words that they base on when they start the revolutionary. Thank you.
Well, in the interest of time, let me just, take on the question quickly. There are 15 members of the Politburo of the Communist Party right now, right? There are seven members of the Politburo developed their career in the Ministry of Public Security. So scholars have been talking a lot about the securitization of the Vietnamese political system, and you can say that it's becoming even a worse policy state than it has always been. But yeah, let's move on. Thank you.
Yes, let's hear your question.
Thank you. First, I have a comment about Dr. Hoang, about Catholics in Vietnam. I remember seeing the photo of Bishop Nguyễn Văn Bình came out and do the labor work. And my family has a father, Father Bùi Minh Sơn. He died some years ago. He's really supportive of Bishop Nguyễn Văn Bình. But when he came back to the north and meeting, the old village, the church right there, the father there refused to receive him because he said that he supports the communists. So that father is really very strongly anti-communist, even he's still living in the old village in Nam Định. Number two, about maybe the church develop and send more Vietnamese priests going overseas. I know two friends. One was ordained last year in Denver. He from Diocese of Jeju. And one was a Salesian priest ordained 2 years ago, working in Sierra Leone, in Africa. Okay, that's it, okay. But here's my question about U.S. Vietnam-Vatican relation. Now we have a permanent representative of Vatican in Hanoi, but he's still staying in a hotel. And we remember that the old embassy was taken, and then there was some years ago there's a demonstration, and Hanoi turned it into a park or something. I met Monsignor Cao Minh Dung 2 years ago in Vatican. He told me that the Vatican embassy cannot be placed or built on any land owned by the Catholics. So my question is, will U.S. and Vietnam and Vatican improve further in terms of relation of the two countries, and so we have more freedom of religion in Vietnam?
Yeah, again, it is a fairly contemporary topic that we have to pay attention to. My guess is that I do know that, right? That Pope Francis, he has, from what Catholic commentators, right, on the global stage has pointed out, is that his policy towards China and then Vietnam, right, definitely marked, right, a turn of a sort, but it's also extremely gradual. So there is a sense that, right, the Vatican treads very carefully on these things, not to damage, any agreements and so far, mainly because it has taken so long, right, for those agreements to come. So I don't know how to answer your question, Fu, about the land issue itself, but it did not surprise me at all, right, that the representative is still staying in a hotel, and there is, no foreseeable, possibility of constructing a proper office. My guess is that it will take a while, precisely because of this, long-standing, tension between the Vatican and the Vietnamese government.
I think it may be time. Oh, okay. Let's have one more question.
Okay, so I heard that next year this symposium will be in Vietnam, maybe it's Hanoi or Saigon. I wonder, any of you will travel to Vietnam to attend the symposium? Will they allow you to be there? Are you free to choose the topic to present, or am I allowed to ask a question like this? Or you are free to mention, told up, or you get out of the room and security stop you and you in trouble?
That's the $35,000 question.
That's the question for the organizers, not for us.
So you are the one who can ask the organizer better than me, because you are the panelist. You are here almost every year.
We're not sure whether we have time yet, like we don't even know, so how can we know? Yeah.
But I have to say though, since they're unkai, my bet is that no matter where the next conference is, he will be there, right? He has been to everyone.
Let me thank all of our panelists, and thanks to everyone in the audience.